Hello students, and welcome back to Political Science 1513, American Federal Government Online. As always, I am your instructor, Connor Alford, and in this week's lecture we're going to begin our exploration of the legislative branch. We'll talk about what it is, how it's structured, why we have it, and how it functions on a day-to-day basis. Towards that end, we've got 5 major learning objectives that you should be able to satisfy by the end of this lecture. The first learning objective asks for you to describe the primary function and the institutional structure of the legislative branch. To satisfy this, you'll need to not only understand what the legislative branch does, but how it is constituted of 2 distinct chambers or separate groups of elected officials. And you'll need to understand the relationships between these 2 chambers and the division of labor that we can use to distinguish between how they function on a day-to-day basis. The second learning objective asks for you to explain the paradoxical way that we feel about Congress. In other words, you should be able to tell us how we feel about Congress. You should be able to tell us why it's puzzling that we feel this way, and you should be able to explain that puzzle away. The third learning objective asks for you to detail the process by which laws are created and to explain why the framers made this system so complicated. The fourth learning objective asks for you to distinguish between the various types and models of representation discussed in lecture. In particular, there are 2 types of representation, descriptive and substantive, that we will talk about, and there are 2 models of representative government that we will talk about, the trustee model and the delegate model. Finally, you should be able to explain what types of representation Congress provides and how well as why they are good at one type of representation but not the other. And to do this, you'll have to be familiar with what we call Mayhew's number 1 goal of the elected official. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the very beginning. So let's look at the legislative branch from a bird's eye view and work our way down. What is the legislative branch? What are its primary components? How are they related to one another? How do we tend to feel or think about the legislative branch? And how does the legislative branch actually go about fulfilling its primary function and creating laws? Oh no, we've already hit a spoiler. Okay, so from prior lecture, you already knew that the legislative branch is that portion of the federal government constitutionally vested with the power and duty to create the laws, or to legislate. And that's not too surprising. So you already know its main function is to create the laws, and that this can be contrasted with the primary functions of the other 2 branches, which are the executive branch, there to administrate the laws, and the judicial branch, there to adjudicate the laws. And we know from prior lecture that all 3 of these branches can check each other, but let's not focus too heavily on that at this moment. I want to take a look at the legislative branch, or Congress, in particular, and we'll work our way towards its relationship with these other branches as we move through the semester. So first, let's establish some clear vocabulary and clarify a common misconception. Congress is a synonym for the term the legislative branch. Congress, or the legislative branch, can also simply be called the legislator. A legislator is a body of lawmakers, and our legislator is divided into 2 chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate. This division of Congress into 2 separate groups or bodies of elected officials that operate more or less independently is what we call bicameralism. Bicameralism is the division of the legislature into 2 separate and independent chambers or houses or groups of elected officials. Those 2 houses, again, are the House of Representatives, which is sometimes called the lower chamber, and the Senate, which is sometimes called the higher chamber. I want to make sure that you understand that the United States legislative branch, or Congress, is made up of both the House and the Senate taken together. And I want to clarify this because sometimes people will tell you that the legislative branch is made up of Congress and the Senate, but that's not true. The Senate is a part of Congress. The legislative branch is made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate, not the Senate and Congress. Because Congress and the House of Representatives are not synonymous. There is room to explain this confusion, however, because whereas a member of the United States Senate is commonly called a senator, a member of the House of Representatives is generally just called congressman or congresswoman. So that creates confusion, but we want to step above that. We want to clarify and elucidate. So let me be clear one final time. Congress is a synonym for the legislature or the legislative branch, which is made up of the House and the Senate. Now that we've established that, let's try to compare the House and the Senate to one another. So to start with, let's begin by taking a look at the House of Representatives. I want you to understand that the House of Representatives is sometimes referred to as the voice of the people. And the reason that it's sometimes referred to as the voice of the people is because the House of Representatives was designed by the framers to promote what we call delegate representation. In delegate representation, individuals elect public leaders who go and communicate and advocate on their behalf, but who do not necessarily exercise their own individual moral judgment or expert discretion. In other words, when the House of Representatives provides delegate representation, it's simply giving the people what they want. The House of Representatives is designed to be responsive to the will of the people, and there are several steps taken by the framers in order to ensure that we get this delegate representation from the House. In other words, the framers designed a system of elections for the House which give the people a great deal of power over who happens to represent them in that chamber. So, for instance, members of the House are given very short 2-year terms. Members of the House also represent congressional districts within individual states, whereas senators, we're going to discover, are going to have to represent entire states at large. They don't have congressional districts. Every voter in an entire state gets to choose whether to keep or replace that state's senators when they're up for re-election. Compare that to, say, Congressman Markwayne Mullin, who represents our district in Congress. Congressman Markwayne Mullin, as the representative for Oklahoma's 2nd Congressional District, is elected by the people of Oklahoma's 2nd Congressional District, which is really the southeastern portion of the state. If you don't know, Oklahoma is divided into 5 distinct congressional districts, each with its own representative. So, for example, Congressional District 5 represents most of the Oklahoma City metropolitan area. Their current representative, as of the recording of this video, is a woman by the name of Stephanie Bice. Well, she's going to be up for re-election in 2022, but people here in Durant don't live in her district, so they have no say in whether she stays in office or is removed. Conversely, people in Oklahoma City, they might get to decide whether Stephanie Bice stays in office, but they have no say in whether Oklahoma's 2nd Congressional District keeps Markwayne Mullin as our representative. The bottom line, then, is that each individual representative has a relatively small district or a relatively small number of voters as compared to senators. And that means it's easier for them to balance the conflicting wants, needs, and interests of their representatives to ensure that people are more or less being given what they want. This being said, it's also important to understand that the primary difference between the House and the Senate is that the House is substantially larger. There are 435 members of the House compared to only 100 senators. And as a consequence of this, we're going to find that business in the House and Senate are run a bit differently. In the House of Representatives, because you have so many people, the day-to-day business has to be conducted according to strong, formal rules and regulations, which do things like limit the amount of time that an individual representative is allowed to speak on a particular issue. Because there are time limits in the amount of time individuals can speak on issues or bills, proposed laws, in the House of Representatives, you do not have filibusters in the House of Representatives. And if you don't know what a filibuster is, never fear, we'll get there when we start talking about the Senate. I also want you to understand that the power of the parties is much more pronounced in the House. In the Senate, individual senators have a great deal of freedom, whereas in the House of Representatives, strong party leadership has given parties like the Republicans and the Democrats a great deal of disciplinary authority which they can use to control individual members and make sure that they hold the line, that they toe the party line. And as a result, the House tends to be somewhat more partisan than the Senate. But at the end of the day, it is important to remember, and this should be in your notes, that the House and the Senate have co-equal lawmaking authority. They have co-equal lawmaking authority. Neither can ever create a law. Neither can ever propose or ratify a bill without the other's consent. every bill has to be approved by both chambers separately and independently before it becomes an actual law, before it is codified into statutes or the body of federal laws approved by Congress. So what we're going to discover then is that they have co-equal lawmaking authority. Higher does not mean greater. Lesser does not mean inferior. Well, if that's the case, if lower does not mean lesser and higher does not mean greater, in what regard is the House lower or the Senate higher? Well, the Senate is higher in a couple of ways. Number one, I want you to understand that because there are fewer members in the Senate, getting into the Senate is a lot more difficult. And because of this, it's also a great deal more prestigious. So the Senate is higher than the House, not in its lawmaking authority, but first and foremost in that it experiences a greater degree of prestige. It is also higher than the House in that it is further from the foundation of power in our country, the people. Remember, we the people are the ones who, in our constitutional system of government, form the basis and foundation for all government power and authority to do things like create rules. So the closer and more responsive you are to the will of the people, the lower we say you are, because a foundation, a base, is at the lowest level. All right, well, that makes sense, but we need to elaborate just a little bit. So what I want you to understand is that while the framers designed a system of elections that make House representatives very responsive to the wants of their people, that's not as true of the Senate. What we're going to find is that the Senate was never meant to give the people a voice in government. Instead, it was meant to give us a mind in government. The Senate was insulated from public opinion by large congressional districts. Remember, they're not elected by particular districts, but by entire states at large, by long 6-year terms that are staggered, as opposed to the simultaneous elections of the House of Representatives. And these steps were taken to insulate them from public opinion so that they could serve as what we sometimes call trustees and provide us with what we sometimes call trustee representation. Trustee representation is when government decision makers serve as legislators who act according to their own expert judgment and personal moral convictions in order to promote the broad interests of their voters. In other words, if delegates are there to give us what we want, then trustees are there to give us what we need. And so what we'll discover is that the Senate is sometimes called the mind of the people because it's less responsive to our wants and more cerebral. It tends to try and think strategically, and it tends to attract more experienced statesmen and stateswomen who are less interested in the politics and more interested in the policy of governing a country. So those are the big differences. And again, basically all of this stimulates from the fact that the House of Representatives is substantially larger. But they're not the only differences we have to talk about. I also want you to understand that while the House and Senate are co-equal in lawmaking authority, there is a certain division of labor, in that the House of Representatives has the power of the purse strings, whereas the Senate has the power of advice and consent for treaties and presidential nominations. The power of the purse strings belongs purely to the House, and the power of the purse strings means that the House of Representatives is able to propose new taxes or budgets. That's not true in the Senate. The Senate can approve or block a new tax bill proposed by the House, but it cannot itself introduce a new tax. So all bills creating a new tax must originate in the House of Representatives. Now, don't get confused. They do eventually still have to be approved by the Senate because neither chamber can make a law without the other's consent. But at the end of the day, the House has a great deal of influence because it wields the power of the purse strings, and the Senate does not. The next dimension of divided labor has to do with advice and consent. Advice and consent is the power of the Senate to either confirm or block presidential nominees to federal offices, or treaties signed by the president with foreign leaders. If the President of the United States signs an agreement with the Prime Minister of Great Britain, or the King of Saudi Arabia, or any other foreign leader, that treaty does not have the force of law until it has been ratified by a 2/3 vote of the United States Senate. But when it's time to ratify those treaties, to exercise advice and consent, understand that the House of Representatives pretty much sits on its thumbs. House representatives don't have any say in treaty laws. Only the Senate does. At the same time, the Senate also has the power to block or confirm presidential nominees to federal positions, like a seat on a federal court, including the Supreme Court, a position in the State Department, say as an ambassador, or a position as the head of one of the 15 cabinet departments, like the Secretary of State or the Attorney General. All of these individual positions are filled by nominees who the president puts forward. But the nominees don't automatically get to fulfill their job. Before a judicial nominee, for example, gets to sit on a court, he or she must be approved by a simple majority vote in the Senate. So the Senate has the power of advice and consent, which means they can block presidential nominees or refuse to ratify treaties, whereas the House doesn't have these privileges. Okay, let's move on to our next learning objective. So how do we feel about Congress? Why is this puzzling? And how do we resolve that puzzle? Well, first I want you to understand that we hate Congress. Congress is extremely unpopular. It is the least popular branch of our federal government. Not only is it less popular than the executive and the judicial branch, it's less popular than a number of things that are broadly hated and loathed, like Nickelback, or cockroaches, colonoscopies, root canals, traffic jams. All of these things are more popular than Congress, according to some of the public opinion data we have available. On average, if you ask the American population, do you generally approve or do you generally disapprove of the job that Congress is doing running our country, only about 15% of them will say that they approve, compared to somewhere between 80 and 85% who will say they disapprove. Now, again, these numbers fluctuate from Congress to Congress, from year to year, from month to month, so on and so forth. But consistently, Congress is very unpopular. People like Brussels sprouts, nature's fart, better than Congress. And that's puzzling because while it is the least popular branch of our federal government, Congress is also the most democratic. Only in Congress are people given the ability to directly elect their political leaders. We don't directly elect anyone in the executive branch. We don't get to elect the President of the United States by a direct popular vote, for example. He, or maybe one day she, is technically going to be elected by a group of individuals called the Electoral College, who we'll talk about in greater depth later this semester. Similarly, we don't get to elect judges on federal courts. We don't get to elect justices on the Supreme Court. They are, as I've said, nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So how is it that the most democratic branch of our federal government is also the least popular? How is it that these people in Congress are able to keep their jobs when everyone hates them? Because remember, we can vote them out of office. We can't just vote the president out of office, but we can very easily do that with a member of Congress. And yet what we're going to find is that when an incumbent, somebody currently in office, runs for re-election, they're going to win their bid for re-election more than 90% of the time. How do we resolve this puzzle? Well, it's quite simple. We hate Congress as a whole, but we tend to like our part of Congress. And that makes sense because remember that while each of us gets to elect our representative in the House or our senators in the Senate, nobody gets to select every single member of Congress. Each member of Congress is going to represent a different district or a different state. So for instance, every state, remember, has exactly 2 senators. In Oklahoma, our senators are Inhofe and Langford as of the recording of this video. And every 6 years, we get to decide whether we want to keep or replace Inhofe. Every 6 years, on a different timeline, but every 6 years, we get to decide whether we want to keep or replace Senator Langford. Similarly, we've got 5 representatives, each representing a different congressional district in our state. And every 2 years, everyone in Oklahoma's 2nd congressional district gets to vote on whether to keep or replace the 2nd congressperson for our state in the House of Representatives, Markwayne Mullin. We don't get necessarily to vote, however, on who the representative for New York is going to be. We don't get to decide who California selects to be its representatives in the Senate. We only get to elect our members of Congress, and therefore those are the ones that we tend to like because they care that we like them. If we didn't like our representative, he would get kicked out of office. So Markwayne Mullin cares very much about the wants, the needs, the preferences, the values, and expectations of voters in his district. Not necessarily of voters in the entire country, but definitely of voters in his district because they can kick him out of office. It doesn't matter to Markwayne Mullin whether people approve of what he's doing in New York City or San Francisco because they're not his boss. He is answerable to the voters of Oklahoma's 2nd Congressional District, and therefore he adopts positions and supports proposals that are consistent with the positions and preferences of Oklahoma's 2nd Congressional District. That's going to aggravate people from places like San Francisco and New York, which both have different values as compared to Oklahoma, but he's fine with that. Their opinions about him don't matter. He works very hard to make sure that he is relatable to voters in his district. He wants us to understand that he is one of us. And so he dresses like us. He talks like us. He does things like wear cowboy boots and jeans. You're not going to see that as frequently in New York City. Okay, AOC, the representative for New York City right now, isn't going to be caught dead in a pair of cowboy boots unless she's being ironic or she's on her way to a gay bar. But Markwayne Mullin wears cowboy boots on a daily basis. It's not unusual. So we like our members of Congress because we select them. And we select them because we can relate to them and because they have similar issue positions and values to ours. But we hate Congress as a whole because when we send that representative or that senator to Washington, D.C., to stand up for our wants, needs, and expectations, they have to compete with other representatives and senators who are standing up for other voters and other value systems that sometimes conflict with our expectations. And as a result, there's a lot of arguing and bickering and gridlock, and it's very hard to get anything done. Which actually leads me into our next learning objective, where you are asked to provide a breakdown of the step-by-step process by which a bill or proposed law becomes an actual statute. Well, before we delve into the individual steps, let's again take a step back and look at this from a bird's eye view. So overall, here's what I want you to know about the process. It's extremely difficult. It is arduous, it is rigorous, and it is inefficient by design. The Constitution was designed to make a very challenging legislative process. And in this regard, it seems to have been quite successful because Congress is not particularly good at getting laws passed. So, for example, the last complete Congress is the Congress which served from 2018 to 2020. That's the 116th Congress. At the time that this video is being recorded, we're in the 117th. And during that Congress, what we're going to find is that there were 16,601 proposed policies, 16,601 bills that Congress considered. And of that 16,601, they passed a little less than 350, which means that for something like 16,300 of these proposed policies, they were basically wasting time on legislation, on proposed policies that they would ultimately kill. And we can see this and we can get very frustrated, because we recognize that there is gridlock, and we recognize that these bills are being proposed by people who have problems and who want to use the law to solve those problems, which, by the way, is what the government is there to do. So, why? Why is this so inefficient? Is it just because the members of Congress are immature? Is it because they're incompetent? Is it because they don't care about the people that elect them? Well, not necessarily. What we will find is that partisan gridlock and polarization in Congress are problems, and they do help to explain some of the inefficiency, but only a very small part of it. I want you to understand that the primary reason Congress passes so few laws, the primary reason that Congress is so inefficient, is that Congress was designed to be inefficient. The framers created a lawmaking process that is extremely challenging. And to understand why, let's look back at that statistic. The 116th legislature considered 16,601 new laws. Now, while it's true to say that each of those laws was a proposed solution to a problem somebody in the public was having, it is equally accurate to say that each of those laws would have taken away some level of freedom currently held by private citizens in our country. Every new law is a rule you have to follow. Laws, by their very nature, might help us to solve problems, but they help us to solve problems specifically by saying you cannot do this or you must do that. And while the framers did value law and order, and they did recognize the utility of government, they also placed a great degree of emphasis and value on individual freedom. So I want you to understand that they intentionally designed a slow and inefficient, a very rigorous lawmaking process first and foremost because they wanted to limit government's overall activity. They didn't want 16,600 new laws that the people had to follow every other year. They wanted only the best laws to pass, only the most popular proposals to be imposed upon the people, and that leads us into the second reason why this system for legislating was made to be inefficient. In addition to limiting government activity, they also wanted to weed out bad bills, bills that were poorly written, bills that wouldn't work as intended, or bills that might work really well but that aren't popular, that don't serve the public's interest, that are exploitative, or that are detrimental to our beliefs and values. Finally, I want you to understand that the third reason the framers made this process so difficult and challenging, and why we might actually appreciate the inefficiency in government, is that the framers wanted to promote public deliberation. Public deliberation is when we, the American people, take part in the public policymaking process. We participate in the discussion. If the process was not inefficient, if it was super quick and easy, then Congress could, say, introduce a law that was 1,000 pages long at 9 a.m. and pass that law very efficiently by 10 a.m. of the same day. And if they did that, if they created an entire new law in a single hour, there would be no public deliberation, because that does not leave enough time for the people to recognize that a law is under consideration, much less recognize that a law is under consideration, conduct research, listen to the arguments presented by both sides, form an opinion, communicate that opinion to their political leaders, and pressure those leaders to comply with that opinion. But if it takes a couple of months to pass a law, well, all of a sudden, we, the American people, have a great deal more time to listen to Republicans arguing about why they want the law to pass, and to listen to Democrats arguing about why they want it to fail, or vice versa. To listen to the arguments presented by both sides, to take these arguments into consideration, to conduct our own research, and to form an opinion on that bill. To take that opinion and communicate it with our leaders so that they know how we want them to vote on the proposal, and then to pressure those leaders so that they actually comply with our wishes. This process creates partisan gridlock. It creates debate and argumentation on purpose, because the framers knew that the longer people in Congress spent bickering about a bill, the more time we, the American people, would have to weigh in, to form opinions, and the more information we would have to form those opinions with. So the system is inefficient to limit government activity, weed out bad bills, and promote public deliberation through rigorous debate. But what are the particular steps of this process? Well, in order to answer that question, I've commandeered a visual aid. You'll also see this in your handout if it's not working for you very well in the PowerPoint. But basically, I'll walk you through this on the off chance that there's somebody who cannot access the visual aid or who is visually impaired. So to begin with, what I want you to understand first and foremost is that the very first step through which all bills or proposed policies must pass is formal introduction. To be formally introduced, a bill must be signed off on by either a representative or a senator. If it's signed off on by a representative, it will begin in the House. If it's signed off on by a senator, it will begin in the Senate. Now remember, if it's a tax bill, it has to begin in the House, but otherwise you can start on either side. So if you have a bill, if you have a proposed policy that you've written and you would like to get passed, you can take that, in most cases, either to your representative or to one of your senators. And that works out great. But keep in mind that if you can't find at least one representative or at least one senator to sign off on your bill, to agree to formally introduce it on your behalf, your bill is dead before it's even started. Once a representative or senator has signed off on a bill, once they formally introduced it to their chamber, this individual becomes what we call the author of that bill. That doesn't mean that they necessarily wrote it, because remember, they can introduce legislation written on other people's behalf, but they are called the author, or sometimes the sponsor. And the job of the author or sponsor who formally introduces a bill is to follow that bill through the rest of this process, advocating for its passage. Once we've gotten through that first step of formal introduction, the next step is for the leadership in your chamber to assign your bill to a committee. A committee is a select subgroup of legislators who are selected from the chamber at large for their expertise or for their particular interest in a specific issue area. And their job is to make an initial assessment of all bills in that particular issue area. So, for example, there is an infrastructure committee that specializes in things like roads. If you are a member of the House of Representatives, but you also have an engineering degree, you might be placed on the House Infrastructure Committee because you've got special expertise that makes you uniquely well qualified to have additional input on bills in that issue area. And if you are, say, Congressman Markwayne Mullin, you might wind up on the Transportation Committee. Not necessarily because you yourself have a great deal of experience in transportation, but you have access to a lot of experts. You have a particular interest in transportation policies because trucking happens to be a very big industry in your district. Trucking is a big industry in Oklahoma's 2nd Congressional District. Lo and behold, Congressman Mullin has, for some time, served on the Transportation Committee. So again, it's a select subgroup of specialists with a particular expertise or interest in a specific issue area. And their job is to make an initial assessment of all bills in that issue area so that they can strengthen them and prepare them for consideration by the entire body, or so that they can eliminate them if they are so poorly written as to be beyond saving. Once you've been assigned to a committee, the next stage is what we call committee markup. During the committee markup process, every member of the committee is given an opportunity to propose changes to the bill. They can add language, they can take language away, or they can simply change language. But every proposed amendment to a policy under consideration by the committee has to be ratified by a majority vote of the committee. And that's the third step, the committee markup. After committee markup, we go to step 4, where we get the full committee vote. During the full committee vote, every member of the committee is given one ballot to cast. And if a majority of the committee agrees to pass the bill as amended, then you get to move on to the next step. But if a majority of the committee says we don't want this bill to move forward, then it's dead. And it is worth noting that most bills do die in committee. Okay, so let's say that we get through steps 1 through 4. We just got passed by committee. The next step is for your piece of legislation to be placed on the calendar for consideration by the chamber as a whole. And again, this is done by leadership. Now, I will briefly note that technically speaking, because the leaders of the House and Senate decide what bills will be scheduled for which days, they have the power at this stage to unilaterally kill a bill for all extents and purposes. Because if they never schedule it for consideration, it cannot be considered. And if you don't consider it, you can't vote on whether to keep it or fail it, and therefore it can't pass. So laws which never make the schedule are essentially dead. On paper, they're still floating around. They could be introduced. They could be put on the schedule. But until they are, they have no chance of passing. Again, let's say, for the sake of our example, that we pass stage 5. We make it to the committee. And then we're passed by the committee and placed on the schedule. Okay, great. The next step is for what we call the House reading and debate to take place, or if you're on the Senate reading and debate. So chamber reading and debate is the next step in this process. During this process, every member of the chamber at large is again given an opportunity to argue about the bill or to propose any changes. It is worth noting that this includes the members who already had an opportunity to propose changes while serving on the committee. So if you are serving on a committee and you propose a change, an amendment to a bill that is shot down by that committee, you can propose it again during the full chamber reading and debate. When everyone is done proposing their changes, voting on whether to keep or reject those changes, when they're done arguing and debating the bill, then we go on to the final vote of passage for that chamber. And if a majority of the chamber agrees to pass your bill, you move on to the other side. But if you cannot get that majority, then again, you've wasted a lot of time because your bill just failed and will not become a law. Let's say for the sake of our example that we started in the House and we finally passed the full House vote. We're not done yet. Once you finish this process on one side, you go to the other side and you go through the entire process over again. Now, this actually complicates matters because in order for a bill to become a law, it must be approved in identical form by both chambers of Congress. And so what that means is that if the House of Representatives sends a tax of 10 cents on every dollar over to the Senate, and then the Senate increases that tax to a tax of 25 cents on the dollar during their committee process, and that's the version of the bill they passed, we don't have a new law yet. We're not ready to go to the president. And the reason that we're not ready is because they haven't proposed the same policy. The House has approved a dime tax. The Senate has approved a quarter tax. These are very, very different policies. They have to find a way to reconcile the differences between the two versions of the bill so that they can pass it in identical form. Now, historically, the way they went about this was through a process that we colloquially refer to as legislative ping pong. The House would send a dime tax to the Senate. The Senate would undo their dime tax, turning it into a quarter tax, and send it back to the House. The House would undo those changes, making it a dime tax, and send it back. So they would just bat it back and forth, and it was an extremely inefficient process. And in order to get around this process, we've added an additional step, a new step in this process through which a bill becomes a law. And we're going to call this final step the conference committee. A conference committee is a special committee comprised of members from both chambers of Congress. And their job is to make final revisions to the bill so as to reconcile any differences which exist between the versions of the bill approved by the House and the Senate. In other words, the buck stops here. They make the last set of revisions. And when they're done making their revisions, they send the bill back to both the House and the Senate. And both the House and the Senate have to have a vote on whether to pass the bill as amended by the conference committee or kill it. They cannot undo the changes of the conference committee. They cannot propose any new changes. It's a simple yes or no. And if both the House and the Senate says, yes, we would like to move forward with the bill as amended by the conference committee, then you get to move on. But if either says no, then the bill is dead. And again, we've wasted a lot of time. The conference committee, I want you to understand, is extremely controversial because while it does effectively resolve the problem of legislative ping pong and therefore make this process somewhat more efficient, it does so at the cost of bill integrity in many cases, and it does so at the cost of transparency in virtually all cases. This is true because, and I want you to understand, the conference committee meets in secret. Nobody knows who serves on the conference committee assembled to make final revisions to any particular bill. Every bill gets its own conference committee made up of individuals selected by the leadership in the House of Representatives and the Senate. But those individuals are going to meet in secret, and they're going to propose their changes in secret. So nobody knows who adds what language or strikes what language from a particular piece of legislation once it winds up in the hands of the conference committee. The reason that they meet in secret is because this helps to facilitate compromise. It insulates them from public opinion, which frees them to make some arguably necessary but often controversial or unpopular sacrifices. And that can, again, help promote efficiency at the expense of transparency. And because this process is not very transparent, we, the American people, can't really punish legislators who add in additional provisions we don't like or who strike language that we did like. And at the same time, the conference committee has an inordinate amount of power because the fact that they get to make final revisions means that they can essentially hold an entire bill hostage to their own electoral prospects through the use of what we call pork barrel projects or pork spending. Pork barrel projects typically involve funding programs whose economic benefits are concentrated in a particular area, but whose costs are spread out among the entire country's tax base. So, for instance, you might get a piece of legislation to authorize the federal government to send money in the form of disaster relief to places affected by a hurricane on the East Coast. And that would probably get through both chambers of Congress pretty quickly, but more likely than not, the version of the bill approved by the House and the version of the bill approved by the Senate would have some very minor differences. So that would go to conference committee. And when it comes out of conference committee, somebody on that committee could add language in there authorizing a $30 billion stimulus bill designed to help fund the construction of highways in California. That additional $35 billion of federal funding for infrastructure in California will probably benefit people in California, but it's going to come out of the pockets of people across the country, not just Californians. It will help, therefore, the senators or the representatives in California to get reelected, but it will do so at the cost of tax dollars from people in places like Oklahoma who don't benefit from that project. And remember that you can't just remove the additional spending. You have to pass the bill as amended by the conference committee or not at all. And what that means is that if you are a representative in Oklahoma, you either have to vote to allow California to suck additional funds out of Oklahoma tax-paying pockets, or you have to vote against disaster relief on the East Coast. This is not a far-fetched example. It's actually a very, very real example. This is something that happens on a regular basis, and it's a big part of why conference committees, where pork barrel projects usually occur, are so controversial. Okay, ignoring the controversy, let's say that this bill did get changed by the conference committee. It was approved by both chambers in identical form. Okay, the next step is for the president to take the bill and either sign it or veto it. The president can veto or decline a bill, and if he does so, it's probably dead. 9 times out of 10, a presidential veto is sufficient to kill a bill. However, I do want to briefly note that this is not always the case. There are some instances in which a presidential veto has been overridden. Because under the Constitution, if 2/3 of the House and independently 2/3 of the Senate vote to pass a bill that has been vetoed, they have overridden that veto. But that's not something that happens very often, because it's difficult to get half of the House and half of the Senate to agree on a particular piece of legislation, much less 2/3 of each individually. So 9 times out of 10, the veto kills the bill. But if the president doesn't veto the bill, if he signs it, or if he does veto it and that veto is overridden, then congratulations, your proposed policy has finally become a law, and that's the process. Remember that it's not enough to get through 90% of these steps. You have to get through every single one of them. You can think about each of these steps like a level on an old video game, like Pac-Man. In Pac-Man, you have no memory card. If you get to level 55 and then you lose your last life, you've got to start over. In the legislative process, if you get all the way to the desk of the president and then you're vetoed and there aren't enough people in the chambers to override that veto, you're done. You have to start over. You've got to find a whole new senator or a whole new representative to introduce a whole new bill, and that bill will have to go through this entire process, and it will probably just wind up getting vetoed again. So again, it's a very arduous process with lots of time and opportunity for argument along the way, and because it's so difficult, only the very best and most popular bills are going to pass, at least in theory. Okay, so now what we can do is we can begin to talk about Congress's secondary function, providing representation. Because it's true that while Congress's primary job is to create the laws, it's also true to say we don't want them just to make any old laws that they see fit. We specifically want them to make laws which are consistent with the wants, needs, and interests of the people. So we turn to Congress not only for legislation, but for representation. And therefore, for the remainder of this video, we're going to talk about how Congress provides representation and how well it does so. We'll discuss the different types of representation and the different models of representative government. And yes, we'll also jump back to Mayhew's #1 goal of the elected official. But before we do, let's talk a little bit about the two main types of representation in American government. We've got substantive representation and we've got descriptive representation. Substantive representation is the sort of traditional understanding of representation, and I'll go ahead and give you a definition. Substantive representation is representing the political wants, needs, and interests of constituents or voters by introducing and campaigning for policies consistent with their preferences. So a substantively representative system is a system which gives people a voice in government. It is a government for the people. And what we're going to discover is that Congress tends to be pretty good at providing substantive representation. Although it doesn't always feel that way, we're going to find that individual representatives and senators do tend to care very strongly about the priorities, the preferences, the wants, needs, and interests of their voters, because if they don't, they know they'll get kicked out of office. So what about descriptive representation? Well, descriptive representation is representing constituents or voters by mirroring their personal, politically relevant, and demographic characteristics. So a descriptively representative system provides people with a face in government, right? This is government by the people. And this is a less traditional understanding of representation because you can provide descriptive representation without necessarily giving the people what they want or need. So for instance, an individual woman in Congress automatically provides descriptive representation to women because she mirrors their relevant gender demographic. But that doesn't mean that she's not going to introduce policies that actually hurt women or that she will introduce policies that do help them. So substantive and descriptive representation are not the same, although some would argue that they are closely related. What we're going to find is that while Congress is generally good at substantive representation, it's terrible at descriptive representation. Looking at the 117th Congress, for example, we're going to find that about 75% of the current Congress is made up of white people. That's overrepresentation for whites and substantial underrepresentation for non-whites. Now, if you break this down and look at some specific demographics, you're going to find certain groups have a worse time getting descriptive representation for their race than others. But on the whole, whites are not one of those groups. Similarly, what we're going to find is that 77% of the current Congress is comprised of men. That's not at all proportional to the demographic distribution of genders in the general public. Women are a pretty sizable majority of the country at this point. That they actually outnumber men in the general population and especially in the voting population. So a descriptively representative Congress would have approximately 50% men and 50% women if half of the public was male and half the public was female. But since a slight majority of the public is female, you should actually have more women in Congress than you have men if Congress is being descriptively representative. Now, don't get this twisted. That does not mean that Congress doesn't care about the wants, needs, or interests of women. Because remember, a male legislator can create policies from which women benefit. And a female legislator can do the opposite. You can provide substantive without descriptive representation. And remember that on the whole, Congress is pretty good at substantive representation. Why? Well, think about Mayhew's #1 goal of the elected official. Here's where I can define the term for you. You need this in your notes. Mayhew's #1 goal of the elected official is to get reelected. Every member of Congress wants to stay in Congress because people in power like to stay in power. And the way that you go about staying in power, if you are a legislator in a Democratic or Republican system, is by getting reelected. So members of Congress do tend to try to provide substantive representation for their voters. They try to create policies that are consistent with the wants, needs, and interests of their voters, regardless of whether or not they look like those voters, because if they fail to do so, they'll get kicked out of office. People don't vote for legislators who consistently campaign against their values, against their wants, their needs, or their interests. And remember that while 77% of the people in Congress might be dudes, a meaningful majority of the voting population in our country is made up of women. So if those men in the Senate and those men in the House begin ignoring the wants, needs, or interests of female voters, they're probably getting kicked out of office. Women have the power to choose which men sit in Congress, as well as which women sit in Congress. And therefore, whether you are a man or a woman, if you're in Congress, you do have a built-in incentive to provide substantive representation to women. Now, again, if you're a man, you cannot give them with descriptive representation, but that's okay for your electoral prospects, because as long as you provide substantive representation, they'll get over it. In other words, Congress is good at substantive representation because we demand substantive representation. But Congress is bad at descriptive representation because on the whole, people don't tend to prioritize that to the same extent. We tend to be more willing to vote for somebody who does not look like us, who does not share our skin color or our gender or our income or our demographic characteristics, but who does provide us with substantive representation, who does seem to care about our wants, needs, and interests, than we would be to vote for somebody who looks like us but doesn't care about us. So Mayhew's number one goal explains why Congress is good at substantive representation, government for the people, but not quite as good at descriptive representation. It gives us a voice in government, but not necessarily a face in government. Congress does not look like us. All right, our last learning objective asks for you to describe the differences between the two main models of representative government. The first of these two models, the traditional model, is what we call the delegate model of representation. And this is a model of representation in which government decision makers serve as instructed delegates. An instructed delegate, in turn, is a legislator who serves as an agent for their voters and makes policies according to the wishes of those voters without regard to his or her own personal preferences. By contrast, in the trustee model, this is a model of representation in which government decision makers serve as trustees. And a trustee, in turn, is a legislator who acts according to his or her own expert judgment and personal moral convictions in order to promote the broad interests of their voters. So, one way to think about this is to understand that a delegate is simply somebody who gives the people what they want, whereas a trustee is somebody who gives the people what he or she thinks they need based on his or her own expert judgment. And the delegate model of representative government, people select representatives to do their bidding when they are not able to speak for themselves. So we say jump, they say how high. They don't enter their own opinions or judgment into the equation. They just follow their instructions. That's why they're called instructed delegates. Whereas in the trustee model, we don't elect people simply to speak for us when we aren't able to be there on our own. We elect people because we trust them. We trust their judgment. And we trust them to give us what we want or what we need, even if it's not necessarily popular. Because what we're going to discover is that most people can recognize that just because an idea is popular doesn't necessarily mean it's good. People tend to recognize or argue that under certain circumstances, the people don't know what's in their own best interest. And that means that if you're skittering around like a cat on a hot tin roof, just giving them whatever they want, sometimes you're actually going to be doing more harm than good. And those individuals who tend to argue that people don't know what's in our own best interest usually prefer the trustee model of representation. Conversely, however, you could also make an argument that while the people may not always know what's in our own best interest, we've got a better idea of what's in our best interest than do the millionaire politicians in Washington, D.C. And we can actually trust ourselves to be self-interested, to have our own best interest at heart, whereas sometimes these politicians pretend to care about us, but in reality are in it for their own enrichment or professional advancement. At the end of the day, which of these you prefer is totally up to you. It's a matter of opinion. People who tend to trust the people more tend to prefer that traditional delegate model, whereas people who tend to trust the statesman or the politician more tend to emphasize the trustee model. But which do we get in reality? Well, in reality, we're going to get a combination of the two. There tend to be certain issues that individual senators and representatives refuse to budge on, regardless of what the public wants. But on other issues, they tend to delegate. They tend to put their own wishes, their wants, needs, and expectations on a back burner, favoring the will of the people. Why? Well, because if you never give the people what they need, then eventually they're going to notice that they're suffering under your policies and kick you out of office. But if you never give them what they want, they're going to get fed up with that and they're going to kick you out of office. So legislators walk a tightrope. Every individual legislator who stays in office for more than one term is probably going to have to provide some degree of delegate representation on certain issues and some degree of trustee representation on other issues. And that's our lecture for today.